Hey there, viewers. Have you ever come across something so disturbing that you wished you had never seen it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Today's story takes a shocking turn. A doctor reviewing Diddy's latest health report was left absolutely terrified after discovering something no one saw coming. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Unsettling Transfer Request. The call came in just before I was about to leave for the night. The landline on my desk, an old rotary-style thing that barely worked half the time, gave its usual rattling ring. I glanced at the clock. 9:17 p.m. Too late for a routine request, too early for an emergency. The night shifts didn't start flagging inmates for real medical attention until the usual fights broke out, which meant whatever this was, it had already been decided hours ago. I let the phone ring twice before picking it up, already knowing I wasn't going to like whatever was on the other end. Yeah. A brief silence, then a voice I recognized immediately. The cold, clipped tone of Warden Matheson. "We need you to process a flagged review." My fingers tightened around the receiver. Matheson didn't handle medical requests, not directly. He had people under him who pushed papers and shuffled around the inmates like livestock. But this wasn't some fresh intake needing a tuberculosis test or a gangbanger with a stab wound. This was something else. "Who's the inmate?" I asked, already reaching for a pen. Another pause, just long enough to make it clear this wasn't an ordinary call. "Cohn." I didn't react right away because that name didn't belong in the same breath as an emergency medical flag. Sean Combs, P. Diddy, or whatever he still called himself these days. He wasn't just another inmate. He was a high-profile prisoner, the kind that didn't get sent here unless somebody really wanted him to disappear for a while. His initial intake had been a spectacle. The press had hounded the gates, snapping photos from the highway overpass as if he were some kind of caged animal. But that was months ago. The media had moved on, and now he was just another body in the system. Except he wasn't. I shuffled through a stack of folders on my desk, searching for his last medical review. It should have been standard, just enough to note his vitals, his weight, any immediate medical concerns. But when I pulled his file, something about it struck me as off. The last official entry was from his hospital visit a few weeks back, a routine MRI for his knee, a lingering issue from a 2003 marathon injury. That part checked out. He'd been transported under strict supervision, escorted by 2 guards and a medical officer. The paperwork showed no complications. So why the flagged review now? I frowned at the sheet in front of me. The words, "Urgent, immediate review required," were stamped in bold red ink at the top of his file. No explanation, no details, just the urgency of it. "What exactly am I looking for?" I asked, flipping through the papers. Matheson exhaled sharply through the receiver. "Just do the review." Then he hung up. I stayed there, staring at the phone like it might start ringing again and give me a real answer. The warden's vagueness didn't sit right with me. I'd been here long enough to know when I was being kept in the dark on purpose. Some inmates get buried, not just in paperwork, but in the walls of this place. I grabbed my coat and the file, stepping out into the dimly lit corridor of the medical wing. The air was thick, the kind of heavy dampness that never really went away in a prison like this. D.C. Brooklyn was a rotting corpse of a facility, a place meant to break men, not house them. The walls sweated with condensation, the air reeked of mildew and bleach, and somewhere down the hall the flickering fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects. I'd worked in other prisons before, but nothing like this. Here the cells were overcrowded, stuffed with twice the number of inmates they were meant to hold. The heat barely worked in the winter, and in the summer the air was so thick with sweat and body odor that you could taste it. Guards ran the place like their own personal kingdom, some just corrupt, others outright sadistic. The medical unit, that was just another extension of the same system. People didn't come here to get better, they came here to be forgotten. I made my way to the records office, a narrow, windowless room filled with rows of outdated metal filing cabinets. The electronic system was unreliable, crashing at least once a week, which meant that hard copies were still king. I dug through the most recent intake reports, cross-referencing his original file with whatever new information had been added since his hospital trip. What I found didn't make sense. His weight was significantly lower than it had been during intake. A drop like that in such a short amount of time wasn't normal, not unless an inmate was starving himself or suffering from something serious. I flipped to the next page, and my stomach tightened. Mental health evaluation pending, subject exhibiting signs of paranoia and food refusal. Psychiatric observation recommended. Refuses to eat institutional meals, claims food is contaminated. I ran a hand through my hair. This was worse than I thought. If he wasn't eating, it wasn't just about weight loss anymore. It was about organ failure, immune system collapse, permanent damage. I needed to see him. Stepping back into the corridor, I signaled for Officer Dunn, one of the few COs who actually gave a damn about protocol. He was already making his rounds, stopping every few feet to bang his baton against the bars of the solitary wing. "Dunn," I called, "I need access to Combs' cell." He frowned, adjusting the thick belt around his waist. "Now?" "Yes, now." He didn't argue, just motioned for me to follow. The walk to the high-profile block was a short one, but the tension in the air made it feel longer. The inmates in this section weren't your average repeat offenders. They were big names, the kind the prison system either wanted to keep hidden or make an example out of. When we reached Combs' cell, Dunn slid the viewing slot open, peering inside. I could see the hesitation in his posture, the slight shift in weight that meant something in there unsettled him. "You sure you want to go in?" he asked, voice lower now. I nodded. He unlocked the door. The smell hit me first. Stale sweat, unwashed fabric, something sour, like old food left to rot. Diddy was sitting on the edge of his cot, arms resting on his knees, staring at nothing. His face was different. The arrogance, the showmanship, the defiant energy he once carried. It was gone. His eyes flickered toward me but didn't focus. I stepped closer, taking in the way his cheeks had hollowed out, his skin duller than before. His movements were sluggish, like his body was struggling to keep up with itself. "I hear you haven't been eating," I said. A slow blink. "They're trying to poison me," he muttered. I sighed, checking his arms for signs of dehydration. His veins were more prominent than they should have been, his hands slightly trembling. This wasn't just paranoia, this was something else. "I need to run some tests," I told him. He didn't respond. Dunn shifted uncomfortably behind me, and for the first time, I caught the briefest flicker of something close to pity in the officer's face. Something was very, very wrong with Sean Combs. And whatever it was, somebody didn't want me finding out. Chapter 2. The health report that didn't make sense. Back in my office, I sat at my desk, flipping through Diddy's medical file, the dim overhead light casting a sickly yellow hue over the pages. The folder was thick, heavier than it should have been, filled with duplicate forms, conflicting notes, and reports that didn't quite align. The more I read, the more my stomach twisted into knots. Something wasn't right. The numbers didn't match up. His weight at intake had been 204 pounds, normal for his build, slightly on the heavier side, but nothing unusual. The next recorded weight taken after his MRI hospital visit, 178. That wasn't just a few pounds shed from stress or poor appetite. That was a full body breakdown happening in real time. A man his size didn't lose that much weight in weeks without an underlying condition. I flipped to the hospital's official report, skimming for anything that might explain such rapid deterioration. The phrasing was sterile, clinical, but beneath the professional detachment there was something off. The section labeled Recommended Next Steps had a large black box of redacted text. It stood out like a wound on the page. a piece of information someone had decided I didn't need to see. I reached for my reading glasses, scanning the page for who had signed off on this report. The usual signatures from prison medical personnel were there, our overworked and underpaid staff who barely had time to check inmates for lice, let alone approve specialty care. But at the very bottom, buried in smaller print, was a name I didn't recognize. Dr. Henry Lowenstein. I frowned. That wasn't anyone from our team. I knew every physician assigned to this facility, and this name had never crossed my desk before. He must have been from Brooklyn Hospital, one of the specialists who reviewed high-profile cases. But why was a hospital doctor making recommendations on an inmate's long-term care? And more importantly, why was this flagged for isolation? I flipped another page, searching for details on why Diddy had been transported in the first place. Officially, the MRI was for his knee injury, something that had been bothering him for over 2 decades. But the timing of the flagged health concerns and this sudden urgency didn't sit right with me. A knee injury wasn't life-threatening, and it sure as hell wouldn't explain why he'd dropped nearly 30 pounds. Then I saw the handwritten note. Scrawled in sharp, precise letters right beneath a routine blood test entry were 5 words that made my skin prickle. Urgent, requires immediate isolation. There was no signature, no official stamp, nothing to indicate who had written it or when it had been added to the file. But the implications were clear. Someone had seen something in Diddy's tests that scared them. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples, the dull hum of the overhead fluorescent lights vibrating in my skull. If isolation was necessary, why hadn't he been placed in medical segregation? That was standard procedure. If an inmate had tuberculosis, meningitis, or any other condition that posed a serious health risk to the general population, they were immediately removed from the main block and placed under constant observation. But Diddy hadn't been moved. He was still rotting in his cell like any other inmate. That meant one of 2 things. Either this wasn't contagious, or someone didn't want it contained. A knock at my door pulled me out of my thoughts. Officer Dunn. His massive frame nearly blocked the entrance as he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, his usual sign of exhaustion, but there was something else. An unease in his eyes, a reluctance that wasn't typical for him. "You find what you're looking for?" he asked, voice low. I held up the folder. "Depends on what I'm supposed to be looking for." Dunn exhaled sharply through his nose, stepping fully into the room and shutting the door behind him. "Look, I shouldn't be telling you this, but some of the guys are saying Combs ain't doing too good. They've seen sick inmates before, but this is something else." I felt the weight of the file in my hands grow heavier. "What do you mean, something else?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "You ever seen a man just shut down? Like his body is still moving, but it's like something inside him is giving up?" The words settled uncomfortably in my chest. I thought back to how Diddy had looked in his cell, the vacant stare, the slowness of his movements, the way his skin seemed to hang off him. "You telling me he's dying?" Dunn shook his head, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "I'm saying it looks like he should be, but he's still going. Barely." I set the file down on my desk, staring at the red-stamped words across the page. "Urgent, requires immediate isolation." "But nobody's moving him," I muttered. Dawn met my gaze. "That's what I don't get." I tapped my fingers against the desk, considering my next move. If whatever Diddy had was serious enough to warrant an isolation order, then why was he still sitting in general population? That didn't happen by accident. Someone had seen the results and made a decision, either to ignore it or to keep it quiet. And the longer I sat here, the more I realized that this wasn't just about his health. Someone was making sure nobody knew the truth. I took a deep breath, forcing the tension out of my shoulders. "I need to run another set of tests," I said finally. "Full blood work, comprehensive panels. I want to see exactly what's happening to him." Don gave me a long look, the kind that said he didn't like where this was going, but knew there was no stopping it. "I'll get you clearance," he said after a beat. "But if I were you, I wouldn't push too hard." He left the room, shutting the door behind him with a quiet click. I sat there for a moment, the silence of the office pressing in around me. The weight of the folder, the redacted lines, the strange test results. They all pointed to something bigger than just a sick inmate. Diddy wasn't just losing weight, his body was shutting down. And I was about to find out why. Chapter 3. The blood work nobody wants to talk about. I spent the next morning pulling every string I could. I knew that if I requested an unredacted version of Diddy's blood work through normal channels, I'd be met with bureaucratic roadblocks, missing files, and delays that could last weeks. If I wanted answers, I needed to go through a different route, one that didn't officially exist. MDC Brooklyn was a failing prison, but it was still a federal facility, which meant there were ways to bypass red tape if you knew the right people. After years of working in this place, I'd made my share of quiet connections, staff who had seen too much, knew too much, and owed too many favors to question a request like this. That's how I ended up in Records Room C, a small, windowless storage unit buried deep in the administrative wing. It smelled like old paper and disinfectant, the kind of sterile, lifeless scent that clung to everything in the building. Inside, a tired-looking data clerk named Harris sat hunched over a keyboard, glasses sliding down his nose. He barely looked up as I entered. "I already processed your request," he muttered, tapping at the monitor. "Didn't come through the main system. Someone must have flagged it as restricted." I felt my jaw tighten. "You got access to it?" Harris exhaled sharply, turning the screen toward me. "I did, but I shouldn't have. The system logs everything. If I pull these files, my name goes on the record." I slid a folded $50 bill across the counter. He snorted, shaking his head, but took it anyway. "You better make this quick." I stepped forward, scanning the full, unredacted blood work report now displayed on the screen. My stomach turned as I read through the markers. The first thing that jumped out at me was his immune system activity. The numbers were disturbing. His CD4 count had dropped so low it was borderline catastrophic, the same kind of numbers you'd see in late-stage HIV/AIDS patients. But there was something else, something that didn't fit. The viral load didn't make sense. If Diddy was suffering from HIV, the tests should have shown a specific pattern. Certain known strains, predictable immune responses. But what I was looking at, it wasn't following any known progression. His white blood cell count had collapsed, but his inflammatory markers were all over the place. Some levels suggested his body was fighting an infection, while others suggested it had already lost the battle. I gritted my teeth. Was it HIV? Or was it something else entirely? There were other anomalies, strange protein markers, elevated toxicity levels, liver enzyme irregularities, indicators of either an experimental drug in his system or exposure to something far worse. A quiet, sinking realization settled in my chest. If someone had deliberately infected him with something, it wouldn't show up on standard tests. I exhaled sharply, stepping back from the monitor. "Print it." Harris gave me a look, but he hit the button anyway. The printer whirred to life, spitting out 3 crisp pages of data, each one more damning than the last. I grabbed them and folded them into my coat pocket. "It didn't see nothing," Harris muttered, already minimizing the files. "And if anyone asks, you didn't either." I left without another word, my pulse thudding in my ears. As I walked back toward the medical wing, my mind raced through possibilities. Was this a pre-existing condition that had suddenly spiraled out of control? Was it the result of drug use, something he'd been taking before prison? Or had something been done to him after his arrest? Before I could dwell on it further, a voice stopped me in my tracks. Dr. Reyes. I turned, spotting Officer Grayson leaning against the hallway wall, arms crossed. Grayson was a lifer in the prison system, a senior CO who had been here longer than most of the inmates. He wasn't known for being friendly or for caring about prisoners beyond what was necessary to keep them in line. "Something you need, Grayson?" I asked carefully. He didn't move, didn't blink. "Word is, you've been poking around in files that don't concern you." A cold weight settled in my gut. If this is about Combs' health— "It ain't," Grayson interrupted. "It's about you overstepping." I narrowed my eyes, trying to gauge how serious this was. "I'm a doctor. If an inmate's health is deteriorating, it's my job to find out why." Grayson chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "That right? And what exactly do you think you're gonna find?" I clenched my jaw. "Something someone doesn't want me to." Grayson pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "Then I'd suggest you stop looking." His voice was lower now, almost casual, like he was offering me friendly advice, but there was an edge beneath it, a quiet warning that sent a chill up my spine. "This is a federal facility," I said, keeping my tone steady. "If an inmate is sick, I have an obligation to—" "You have an obligation to keep your head down," Grayson cut in. "Do your job, treat your patients, and stop acting like you're some kind of investigator." I didn't respond. Grayson studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "Look, I don't give a damn what happens to Combs. He ain't special. You think the people running this place care if he makes it to trial in one piece?" He shook his head. "If he keels over in his cell, there'll be another body in his place before the morning shift." I felt a slow burn in my chest, a mix of frustration and something deeper, a creeping sense of inevitability. "What's really going on, Grayson?" I asked. "Why are you warning me?" For the first time, his expression flickered with something close to concern. "Because you're asking the wrong questions," he muttered, "and you're asking them too loudly." He turned and walked off, leaving me standing alone in the dim hallway, gripping the blood work results in my pocket like they might disappear if I let go. I knew I should let it go. I should chalk it up to prison politics, bureaucratic incompetence, and the simple truth that inmates, especially high-profile ones, don't get the same level of care as people on the outside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than a neglected medical condition. I walked back to my office, heart pounding, locking the door behind me as I unfolded the printouts. Diddy's immune system wasn't just failing. It was shutting down in a way that didn't fit any known disease. And someone, maybe multiple people, didn't want me to find out why. Chapter 4. The Patient Who Refuses to Eat. I made my way down to Diddy's cell with the blood work results still weighing heavy in my pocket, the thin sheets of paper folded so tightly they were beginning to crease. The corridor leading to his unit was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent bulbs casting erratic shadows along the cracked concrete walls. The air was thick with the familiar sense of sweat, mildew, and something stale, something that reminded me of old food left to rot. The high-profile block was quieter than the others. Here, the inmates weren't shouting through their bars or banging their fists against the metal, demanding attention. This was a different kind of hell. The kind that worked slowly, methodically, pressing down on its inhabitants until they stopped fighting back. Diddy's cell was at the far end, the last one in the row. I could hear the faint sound of a plastic tray scraping against the floor, the dull clink of metal on ceramic, but no real movement beyond that. When I reached the door, Officer Dunn was already waiting for me. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice low. I gave a slight nod. Dunn exhaled through his nose and unlocked the door, pushing it open just enough for me to step inside before sealing it shut behind me. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. It was colder in here than in the rest of the block, the kind of damp chill that clung to the skin and made everything feel just a little heavier. The second thing I noticed was the smell, something sour, almost metallic, mixed with the musty dampness of old concrete and sweat-soaked fabric. Diddy was sitting on the edge of his cot, hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His hands hung between his legs, fingers slack, unmoving. His face was worse than the last time I'd seen him. The weight loss was more apparent up close, cheekbones sharp against his skin, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. His lips were dry, cracked at the edges, and his skin had taken on a dull, almost grayish hue. He barely acknowledged my presence. His gaze was fixed on the far wall, unblinking, as if he was watching something the rest of us couldn't see. I took a slow step forward. "You haven't been eating." Nothing, not even a flicker of recognition. His food tray sat untouched on the floor beside him, a portion of overcooked rice and some kind of grayish meat congealing in its own grease. The plastic fork rested on top of it, still clean, as if he hadn't even considered trying. I crouched down beside the tray, picking it up and giving it a slight shake. "What's wrong with it?" Diddy's jaw tightened, and for the first time, his eyes shifted toward me. "You tell me," he muttered, voice rough, like he hadn't used it in days. I frowned and took a closer look at the food. It looked normal, if prison food could ever be called that. The usual cheap cafeteria slop, the kind of meal that wasn't meant to nourish, just to keep bodies functioning. "You think it's poisoned?" I asked, watching him carefully. Diddy's gaze darkened. He leaned back slightly, his fingers twitching at his sides. For a moment, I wasn't sure if he was about to laugh or lash out. "They want me weak," he said finally. "They put something in it. I can taste it." I didn't respond right away. His voice wasn't panicked, wasn't frantic. It was slow, deliberate, like he had already resigned himself to this truth. Like he had spent weeks trying to figure out exactly what they were doing to him. I set the tray aside and sat on the metal stool across from him. "Who's they?" A bitter smile flickered across his face. "You already know." He let his head tilt back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling. His fingers pressed lightly against his stomach, as if he were feeling for something beneath the skin. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "It's inside me," he murmured. A chill ran down my spine. "What is?" I asked carefully. His throat bobbed slightly as he swallowed. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I feel it moving." I studied him closely, taking in the way his muscles seemed to tense involuntarily, the slight tremor in his hands. His skin was colder than it should have been, his pulse weaker than I expected. Paranoia, malnutrition, psychological breakdown. I wanted to believe it was just that this was the natural deterioration of a man who had spent his entire life controlling the world around him, only to wake up one day and realize that the world no longer cared. But then I thought about the blood work. The immune system collapse, the unknown markers, the urgency behind the hospital's warning. Something about his condition wasn't normal. Diddy's breathing slowed, his eyes drifting closed for a moment before snapping back open. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, as if he was afraid someone might be listening. "I wake up in the middle of the night and it feels like something's burning. Like my insides are eating themselves," he exhaled shakily. "And my skin? It don't feel like mine anymore." I glanced at his arms. There were no open sores, no visible infections. But I had seen this before, not in prison, but in terminal patients. People whose bodies were shutting down, whose nervous systems were so frayed that even their own skin felt foreign to them. "I need to run more tests," I said. Diddy let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "Yeah. And what's that gonna do? It'll tell us what's happening to you." He shook his head. "They already know." I clenched my jaw. "Then we'll know too." For the first time since I'd stepped into the room, his expression changed. Not fear, not paranoia, just exhaustion. a deep, consuming exhaustion that made him look even smaller, even frailer. I reached into my coat, pulling out a small, sterile vial and a fresh syringe. "I'm taking another blood sample. If something is in your system, I want to know what." Diddy didn't move at first. Then slowly, deliberately, he rolled up his sleeve. The moment I inserted the needle, I noticed it. His blood was too thin. The color was wrong, not the usual deep red, but something darker, more diluted. Diddy was watching me the entire time, his lips parted slightly, his voice barely a whisper. "You ever see blood like that before, Doc?" I forced my expression to remain neutral as I withdrew the syringe, capping the vial and slipping it into my coat pocket. "No," I admitted. He smiled faintly, but there was no amusement in it. "Then you're already too deep in this." I stood, giving Dunn a signal. The door opened behind me, and I stepped out without another word. As I walked back toward my office, the vial of dark, thinning blood felt like a weight in my pocket. Each step a reminder that whatever was happening to Sean Combs, it wasn't natural. And worse, someone already knew. Chapter 5. The Missing Medical Files. The blood vial sat in the bottom drawer of my desk, sealed, labeled, waiting. I should have sent it to the lab immediately, but something in my gut told me to hold off. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I wasn't sure who else was watching. Everything in this prison went through too many hands before it ever reached its intended destination. If someone was already trying to suppress the truth about Diddy's health, there was no telling what lengths they'd go to in order to keep that truth buried. Instead of sending it off, I focused on the next logical step, pulling his old medical records. If Diddy was suffering from an immune disorder, late-stage infection, or something experimental, there should be some kind of history. No disease develops overnight. There had to be signs, early symptoms, treatments, a documented pattern of decline. But when I logged into the BOP Central Medical Database, I was met with something that made my pulse slow. File not found. Not a restricted notice, not a redacted document, just a blank error page, as if the file had never existed in the first place. I clicked out, refreshed, tried a different query. Nothing. Diddy was a man who had lived in the spotlight for decades, but according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons medical system, he didn't have a single documented condition. No previous illnesses, no pre-existing conditions, no record of past hospitalizations, prescriptions, or specialist visits. It didn't make sense. Even the most high-profile inmates had at least some record of treatment prior to incarceration. I had pulled files on mob bosses, cartel leaders, politicians, men who had the means and power to wipe their histories clean, but even they had some breadcrumbs of medical history left behind. Diddy, on the other hand, had nothing. It was as if someone had gone in and erased every trace of his past from the system. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my jaw as I stared at the blank screen. Someone did this on purpose. There was a knock at my door and I snapped my laptop shut. Officer Dunn stepped in, his expression unreadable. He wasn't in uniform, no badge, no belt, just his plain undershirt and slacks. That wasn't normal. "Figured I'd stop by before this goes any further," he said, shutting the door behind him. I folded my arms. Before what goes any further? Dunn didn't answer right away. He took a seat in front of my desk, exhaling slowly. "Been hearing things. Inmates talk, guards listen." He gave me a long look. "You're not the only one trying to figure out what's happening to Combs." I felt a cold tension settle in my chest. "Who else?" Dunn shook his head. "Not sure, but I know this much. Somebody's been giving him pills." I stiffened. "They got him on a prescription?" "Not officially." I frowned. Every medication inside MDC had to be documented, signed off by medical staff, and approved through multiple channels. If Diddy was taking something, I would have seen it in his charts. "What kind of pills?" Dunn hesitated, then shook his head. That's the thing, no one knows. He's not getting them from the infirmary, that's for damn sure. But at least 3 guys in his block have seen him taking something. Small white capsules. Doesn't share. Doesn't trade, just pops them and waits. I thought back to the way he had clutched his stomach, the way he talked about something being inside him. If he's taking something, he has a supplier, I said. Dunn nodded. That's what I figured. I had one of my guys check our logs. No outside prescriptions were transferred with him when he came in. He rubbed his chin. Means someone's giving it to him under the table. I exhaled sharply. An inmate getting access to off-the-books medication wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was dangerous. Who? I asked. Dunn's jaw tightened. Could be a CO, could be another inmate, could be someone from your side of the fence. I stiffened. He wasn't wrong. Medical staff weren't above corruption. I had seen nurses smuggle painkillers for gang members, orderlies slip antipsychotics to inmates who had caused problems. It wasn't hard to make a drug disappear if the right person signed off on it. But this wasn't just someone sneaking in sleeping pills or contraband opioids. This was something hidden, buried, something only he was taking. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. Dunn, if someone's giving him drugs off the books and his files are missing, that means someone high up wants this kept quiet, he finished for me. A heavy silence settled between us. I could feel it now, the weight of something bigger than just a sick inmate. I had spent years working in this prison, but this was different. Dunn ran a hand over his face. Look, you're a good doc. I got respect for you. But this thing, it's not worth your career. I narrowed my eyes. You telling me to drop it? I'm telling you that whatever's happening to Combs, you ain't gonna be the one to fix it. He met my gaze. And if you keep pushing, you're gonna end up in a situation you can't walk away from. I didn't answer. Dunn sighed, standing up. I'll keep my ears open, but you didn't hear this from me. Then he was gone, leaving me alone in my office with nothing but a blank medical record and a growing sense of unease. I turned back to my desk and pulled the blood vial from my drawer, turning it over in my hand. The colors still looked wrong. Thinner, darker. If he was taking something, if someone was giving him something, it would show up in his system. I grabbed a fresh lab requisition form, filling out the necessary fields. This time I wasn't running it through normal channels. There was a third-party lab I knew, a forensic analyst I'd worked with before on disputed drug cases, someone who owed me a favor, someone who could test for things the prison lab wouldn't even bother looking for. I filled out the form under an alias, placed the vial in an unmarked sample bag and sealed it. Then I picked up my phone and dialed the number. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. Yeah, it's Reyes, I said. I need a full talk screen on a sample, everything. A pause. Everything? Yet, the voice hesitated. You sure? I glanced at the blank screen on my laptop, the missing files, the name that had been erased from the system. No, I admitted, but I need to know anyway. Another pause, then a quiet sigh. Send it over. I'll get back to you in a few days. I hung up, leaning back in my chair, my pulse a slow, steady drum in my ears. I knew I had just crossed a line, but it was too late to stop now. Something was inside him, and I was going to find out what. Chapter 6. The Secret Meeting. The air was heavy with rain, the kind that didn't fall in sheets but in a slow, endless drizzle that made the city feel damp and swollen. The streets glistened under the dim glow of flickering streetlights, and the late-night traffic was sparse, just the occasional passing headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. I pulled my coat tighter around me, my collar turned up against the cold as I crossed the parking lot toward the agreed-upon meeting spot. The hospital's underground garage was nearly empty, save for a few scattered sedans and an old, rusting maintenance van pushed into the farthest corner. The walls were stained with years of water damage, the fluorescent lights above buzzing weakly, casting pale, sickly hues against the concrete. It smelled of oil, damp metal, and something faintly medicinal, like old antiseptic that never quite washed away. I spotted the man almost immediately. Dr. Elliot Chambers. He was standing near the far column, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his gray overcoat, his face partially hidden in the shadow of his raised hood. He looked exactly the way I remembered him, thin, wiry, with tired eyes and a nervous energy that made it seem like he was always looking over his shoulder. He had been a specialist in immunology at Brooklyn Hospital for nearly 2 decades, but I hadn't seen him in years. I approached slowly, keeping my footsteps light, my body tense. Something about this meeting didn't sit right with me. It felt too clandestine, too forced, like we were characters in a bad spy novel. "You're late," Chambers muttered, his voice low. I exhaled sharply. "You're the one who chose the meeting place." He let out a dry chuckle but didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced around the garage, his fingers twitching at his sides. He was anxious, more than usual. "You said you had something for me," I pressed, keeping my voice steady. He hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small manila envelope. It was thin, worn at the edges, like it had been handled too many times before finally making its way into my hands. He extended it toward me, but when I reached for it, he didn't let go immediately. "This conversation never happened," he murmured. I met his gaze. Understood. After a beat, he released the envelope and took a small step back, his expression shifting from wary to something closer to resigned. I flipped open the flap and pulled out the contents, a single sheet of paper. Not a full medical report, not an official document, just a photocopy of something incomplete. At the top, I recognized the hospital's letterhead, the same format used for internal lab results. Below that, a list of patient vitals, height, weight, age. The name was redacted, but the patient ID number matched the one on Diddy's medical file. Then I saw the test results. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just standard blood work. These were specialty panels, the kind that weren't run unless someone had a reason to suspect something more than routine illness. I scanned the markers: abnormal white blood cell activity, unusual protein signatures, viral fragments that didn't match any known database. The immune system failure was obvious, but the breakdown wasn't behaving like HIV, cancer, or any other degenerative disease I'd ever seen. It was something else entirely. I looked up at Chambers, my voice lower now. "What the hell is this?" He shifted on his feet, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's the same question we asked when we ran the tests." My grip on the paper tightened. This wasn't in his official report. Chambers let out a humorless laugh. "No, it wasn't." I frowned. "So, what happened? Why was it pulled?" He hesitated before speaking. "Because we weren't supposed to find it." The words sat heavy between us. I swallowed. "Explain." Chambers inhaled slowly, exhaling through his nose before lowering his voice. "I was one of the specialists assigned to review the flagged results. When we saw the numbers, we knew something was wrong. This isn't a natural condition. It mimics things we've seen: immune collapse, viral decay, but the markers don't match anything in the standard pathology database." I felt a cold unease creeping up my spine. "You're saying this isn't a disease?" "I'm saying whatever he has, it wasn't supposed to show up in someone like him." I stared at him. "What the hell does that mean?" Chambers glanced around the parking garage again, like he expected someone to emerge from the shadows. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There are certain conditions, certain infections, that don't occur naturally. They have to be introduced." A sharp pressure built in my chest. "You think he was exposed to something on purpose?" Chambers didn't answer immediately. I think He was part of something he wasn't supposed to be, whether he knew it or not. I ran a hand down my face. Jesus. Chambers stepped closer. Look, I'm telling you this because I know you won't let it go, but you need to be careful. People higher up than us already decided this isn't worth investigating. The minute those results came back, the files were pulled, the reports buried. We were told to move on. I clenched my jaw. By who? He hesitated. It wasn't the hospital. I went rigid. The only people who could bury a report like this weren't doctors or administrators. They were federal. This went beyond MDC Brooklyn. Chambers sighed, rubbing his forehead. Listen, you're in deep enough as it is. If I were you, I'd drop it. I exhaled slowly, staring down at the sheet of paper in my hands. Every instinct told me to walk away, to pretend like I had never seen this. But I knew I wouldn't. Because whatever had happened to Diddy, whatever was still happening to him, it wasn't just neglect. It was deliberate. Chambers ran a hand through his hair, glancing toward the exit. I gotta go. I looked up at him. If I need more? You won't, he interrupted. That's the last trace of those results you'll find. Anything else was wiped. I nodded slowly. Thanks. He gave me a tight, unreadable look. Yeah. Good luck, Reyes. Then he was gone, disappearing into the stairwell without another word. I stayed there for a moment, listening to the distant hum of the city outside. The paper in my hands felt heavier than it should have, the ink pressing into my skin like an imprint I wouldn't be able to wash away. The rain had picked up by the time I stepped outside, cold droplets tapping against my coat as I made my way back to my car. The city around me was still alive, horns blaring in the distance, headlights cutting through the misty air, but everything felt different now. I unlocked the car and slipped into the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. Something was inside Diddy, something that shouldn't have been there.
And now I knew for sure someone was making sure the world never found out.
Chapter 7. The Disease That Shouldn't Exist. I sat in my office, staring at the pile of evidence scattered across my desk. The blood work results, the missing medical files, the hospital report that had been scrubbed from the system. It was all there, spread out in front of me like pieces of a puzzle that shouldn't exist. The fluorescent light above flickered weakly, casting a sickly glow over the papers. The ink smudged where my fingers had gripped the pages too tightly. I had spent my entire career dealing with the grim reality of prison healthcare. Neglect, misdiagnosis, untreated infections, slow, miserable deaths that could have been prevented with the right care. But this wasn't neglect. This wasn't an accident. Something had been done to him. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Diddy's immune system wasn't just shutting down, it was failing in a way that didn't make sense. His white blood cell count was obliterated, yet his inflammatory markers were erratic. His liver enzymes suggested toxicity, but there was no clear source of poisoning. His body was deteriorating, but not in any pattern I had ever seen before. It mimicked AIDS, autoimmune disorders, late-stage viral infections, but it didn't align with any known disease. And that was the most terrifying part of all. I thought about what Chambers had told me in that parking garage, the way his voice had dropped when he said, whatever he has, it wasn't supposed to show up in someone like him. The words echoed in my skull, taking on a more sinister meaning now that I was looking at the full scope of the situation. Had he been deliberately infected? Was this some kind of biological sabotage? I didn't want to believe it, but the facts were there. The missing medical records, the secret prescriptions, the hidden hospital notes. Someone had erased his medical history. Someone had been giving him medication off the books. Someone had made sure that whatever was happening to him would never be traced back to its source. I glanced down at the blood vial still sitting on my desk. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained more than just physical evidence. as if it held a truth that I wasn't supposed to know. I needed answers. Pulling out my phone, I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. A forensic pathologist I had worked with years ago, someone I knew I could trust, the kind of person who didn't ask questions unless they absolutely had to. The line rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Yeah?" "It's Reyes," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "I need a second set of eyes on something." There was a pause. Then, "This about that sample you sent me?" A chill crawled up my spine. "You got results?" A sigh. "Yep, and you're not gonna like them." I closed my eyes for a brief second, steadying myself. "Tell me." The pathologist hesitated. "Look, I ran every panel I could think of. Viral loads, bacterial cultures, toxicology screens. But whatever's in his system, it's not acting like anything I've ever seen before." I frowned. "Explain." "There's immune collapse, but no traceable virus causing it. No HIV, no hepatitis, no standard immunodeficiency pathogens. His system is failing, but not in a way that makes sense. It's almost like..." The voice trailed off. "Like what?" I pressed. "Like something was introduced to break down his defenses deliberately?" I went still. "You're saying this was engineered?" "I'm saying it doesn't look natural. If I didn't know any better, I'd say his immune system was being attacked by something synthetic, something designed to target it directly." My grip on the phone tightened. "Designed by who?" Another pause. "That's the question, isn't it?" I exhaled slowly, staring at the blood vial on my desk. The realization was sinking in, cold and sharp. This wasn't just an illness, it was a weapon. I rubbed my forehead. "How long does he have?" The pathologist hesitated. "Hard to say. Weeks, maybe less if whatever's in his system keeps accelerating. The body can only fight itself for so long before it gives up." I swallowed hard. "All right. Thanks." "Reyes?" The voice on the other end was quieter now, more cautious. "Be careful with this. If someone did this to him on purpose, you don't want to be the one asking the wrong questions." I hung up without responding, my pulse thudding in my ears. I was already asking the wrong questions. The door to my office creaked open, and I nearly jumped. Dunn stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. "You got a minute?" he asked. I nodded stiffly. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "You look like you just saw a ghost," he muttered. I let out a slow breath. "Might as well have." Dunn eyed the papers scattered across my desk, the tension in his jaw tightening when he saw the hospital report I had smuggled out. "Shit," he muttered. "You really aren't letting this go." I ran a hand through my hair. "I can't, not after what I just found out." Dunn let out a sharp exhale, rubbing his forehead. "I was hoping you'd say that." I frowned. "Why?" He hesitated before pulling something from his pocket and tossing it onto my desk. A small, clear plastic bag. Inside was a single white capsule. My stomach turned. "Where did you get this?" "Information of the inmates in Combs Block." Dunn's voice was low, careful. He swiped it when the guards weren't looking, said he'd seen Combs taking them at night, but never saw where he got them from. I picked up the bag, turning it in my fingers. The pill was unmarked, no pharmaceutical branding, no identifiable markers. A custom compound. "What the hell is this?" I muttered. "That's what I was hoping you'd tell me." I set it down next to the blood vial. Dunn folded his arms. "Reyes, you need to decide how deep you want to go with this, because if you start looking into who gave him those pills, you might not like what you find." I clenched my jaw. Everything was pointing to one truth. Diddy wasn't dying because of a disease. He was dying because someone wanted him to. And I was going to figure out who. Chapter 8. the files that disappeared overnight. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into my office. The air felt different, thinner, unsettled, like someone had been here and hadn't bothered to put things back exactly as they were. My desk chair was slightly out of place, angled just a little too far from the center. My drawers were closed, but not fully, just enough that someone in a hurry hadn't taken the time to shove them all the way in. I didn't move at first. I just stood in the doorway, my breath coming slower, my pulse a quiet, steady thud in my ears. Then I stepped inside. The moment I did, I saw it. Everything was gone. The blood work, the hospital records, the test results, the vial. I ripped open the top drawer, rifling through the folders. Nothing. I went for the manila envelope from Chambers, the one I had tucked away under a stack of unrelated paperwork. That, too, was missing. I yanked open the file cabinet, my fingers trembling now, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I had printed extra copies. I had thought I was being careful, but as I flipped through the folders, I realized they were all replaced, swapped out with standard reports that hadn't been touched in years. It was as if the last few weeks had never happened. I turned to my laptop, flipping it open with a sharp flick of my wrist, my breathing shallow as I logged in. I went straight to Diddy's file, navigating through the prison medical database with the speed of someone who had spent years drowning in this system. My stomach clenched. The report that had once been stamped with urgent red warnings, the flagged notations, the discrepancies, all of it was gone. In its place, a single nondescript entry. Routine observation, no concerns. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring for a moment as my brain tried to process what I was seeing. No concerns. As if the weight loss, the malnutrition, the immune collapse, the missing files, the pills, the experimental compounds, none of it had ever existed. I scrolled further. The dates had been corrected, altered to reflect a normal, uneventful timeline. The psychiatric evaluations that had warned of his paranoia, his food refusal, his insistence that something was inside him, gone. I leaned back in my chair, my hand gripping the edge of the desk so tightly my knuckles ached. Someone had gone through and scrubbed everything clean. Not just covered it up, erased it. My office door creaked open behind me, and I didn't even flinch. I already knew who it was before he spoke. Dunn exhaled heavily. "It's done, isn't it?" I didn't answer. He stepped further inside, shutting the door behind him. "I told you." His voice wasn't mocking. There was no satisfaction in it, just exhaustion. I let out a slow breath, running a hand down my face. They'd made it like it never happened. Dunn nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "They always do." I turned back to the screen, my eyes burning. It's not just him, is it? Dunn was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "You think he's the first?" The weight of his words settled over me like a thick, suffocating fog. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a single case of medical negligence or a bureaucratic failure. This was procedure. They had done this before. I thought about the other inmates, the ones who had wasted away in their cells, the ones who had died from undocumented complications, the ones whose names had been forgotten, erased just like this. Diddy was famous, high profile, and yet even he had been reduced to a ghost in the system. I swallowed hard. What happens now? Dunn exhaled through his nose. "Nothing." I turned to face him. "And what if he dies?" Dunn shrugged. "Then he dies." My chest felt tight, my stomach twisting in knots. "And that's it?" Dunn didn't answer. He didn't need to. I clenched my fists. "This isn't right." Dunn let out a bitter laugh. "No, but it's reality." He shifted his weight. "You should let this go, Reyes. They already did." I stared at him, my pulse slow and heavy in my veins. I should have felt defeated. I should have let it go. But I couldn't. Because I knew the truth now. I knew what they were capable of. And if this could happen to a man as powerful as Diddy, how many others had disappeared this way? How many more would? Dunn turned to leave. Before he walked out, he paused, speaking without looking back. "Get some rest, Doc." I sat there long after he was gone, staring at the empty screen, at the falsified records, at the erased existence of a man who was still alive. But for how long? I thought about the blood vial, the test results that were gone. But I still remembered what they said, and they couldn't erase that. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and stared up at the flickering fluorescent lights. Somewhere in this prison, Diddy was still alive. But whatever had been inside him, whatever they had buried, it was still there. And now it was never coming out.